Hey everyone, and welcome to my video overview of Chapter 7, Remediating Deficits in Socialization. Today, our learning objectives for this chapter include that you as a learner would be able to describe socialization characteristics that are present in many individuals with autism and the implications of those characteristics for social functioning. Also, to differentiate between social competence and social skills. Those are two different things, and explain methods for determining the social skills needed by students with autism, and describe interventions for improving socialization in students with autism, which, that's the focus of what we're doing here, and then describe strategies for facilitating the generalization of new social behaviors, which is really, really important. So our first focus here today is socialization characteristics and what those implications are for our students with autism. First of all, keep in mind that social behavior is very complex and it does vary depending upon who's involved, where you are, and so many factors that, it's really a complicated process. And the differences in social settings can be very subtle, so it can be very hard to pick up on. In general, it involves verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Much of our communication is nonverbal, so keep that in mind. In a social situation, communication is what you're doing. So there's a lot that that falls into that beyond just what is verbally expressed. Communication is the facilitator of social behavior. So again, that's a key factor here. So when our students have challenges in that communication sector, which is a primary definer of autism, then naturally we're going to see some challenges in social behavior. It does differ by age. There are several types that are critical throughout the lifespan when it comes to social behavior. People in general people are expected to initiate and respond to interactions with others. They're expected to take turns. They're expected to understand subtle social cues, be aware of another person's point of view and perspective, and be able to engage in conversations and activities based on shared interests. So there's a lot going on there. Critical social skills areas that we characteristically see as a limitation for children with autism include things like joint attention. And so you'll see that as a really pivotal skill that you need to work on with your students, because not having that joint attention obviously creates an issue in a social interaction. If that child will not pay attention to the same thing as someone else will, then you're not having as much of a social situation. But we do see a lot for as far as social initiations go for children with autism, would be things like autistic leading, where they take someone by the hand and lead them to a preferred object of some kind that they need or want. And that's their way of communicating, hey, I want this. So that is a social behavior that you want to definitely start with, at least work with, and go from there. Socialization deficits may be related to cognitive and communication deficits. Makes sense, right? If you have a communication deficit, it's really difficult to then have really great social skills. And if you have some cognitive barriers, then it's going to be hard for you to pick up on those subtleties related to social interaction, successful social interaction, social competence. So what happens? Well, we know with those socialization deficits, life can be challenging. It is important to have good social skills in order to be functioning in almost all aspects of life in general. And it's also important to note that social skills and social interest are important predictors of successful functioning later in life. So we're not saying they have to be a social butterfly, but you are going to need some social skills to help reduce barriers to, things that you really, really want. So it's important that we work on those skills with our students. Okay, big issue here. The ultimate goal for teaching social skills is to improve a student's overall social functioning. So their social competence, which is the application of skills. So you can't stop at just teaching a social skill or a set of social skills. You need to keep going to where you are really focusing on that generalization and maintenance of those skills, where the student actually has to apply it in different social settings, and ultimately when you're not there. So you don't want to focus on teaching skills in isolation. You need help and involvement from peers, from other adults, from families. This is definitely, social skills is a big picture project. It's not just you and the student working on this one. So again, social competence is other people's perceptions of an individual's social performance. So how everyone else feels about how that student or that individual conducted him or herself socially. And so in that space, socially competent individuals generally can initiate and maintain friendships. They can interact appropriately with authority figures, and they can manage stressful situations. Obviously not all the time, we all struggle with aspects of that, but these are not easy tasks, but generally speaking, that's what a socially competent individual is able to do. Social skills are those discrete social behaviors that are typically exhibited by those who are considered socially competent. So things like, and this will vary by culture or even region, which is related to culture in general, but things like eye contact or maintaining eye contact, being able to ask relevant questions, greet others or respond to greetings from others, being able to play with others, maintaining appropriate personal space, which again can change based on the region you live in and the area's culture. So it's important that you consider the cultural relevancy of the social skills you're teaching, because it's not the same everywhere. And some things may not be as important. Like it may be really important to you, but that may not actually be a super important skill for the child in the environment he or she lives in or wants to be in eventually. And just keep in mind that just because a student can exhibit those social skills, those discrete skills successfully, does not mean that they are socially competent. That's just one step in the process. Next step is, now that we know what the implications are, we want to sit down and figure out how to assess our students in their social skills so we can prioritize and set goals and figure out what is the curriculum we're going to follow, or what our plan is for our student. First step, determine what the child needs to learn. You're going to be thinking about, like I mentioned previously, what are the contexts in which this child functions, and what are the social demands in those contexts? What's the social culture in those contexts? And you really want to look at that so you can figure out what are the socially valid skills, what are the really important social skills in those different contexts. And this is not what like you want to see necessarily. It's what are the socially competent individuals in those environments wanting to see. So if you're looking at, peers, so the students' peers, you need to look at what they deem as socially acceptable in those settings and help teach those skills, not what teacher deems as socially acceptable necessarily, okay? And that's important. Child's level of socialization in those contexts is important to understand, because you need to know what are the skills that they need to learn? What are the strengths and weaknesses here? What do we need to focus on? So the first step, remember all those ecological inventories that we talked about previously in that activity that you engaged in. Here, when we do social skills assessment, ecological inventories are a key component of that. So you're going to see this again. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what are the target environments where the students have, where the student will have opportunities for social interaction. Talk to those teachers in those environments or other adults that might be supervising students in those settings to figure out what are the social expectations and the skills involved in those environments. And once you have that information, then you're going to do that ecological assessment, because you're going to want to have kind of a big picture idea as you go in, so you can be looking for certain skills and how they are implemented by the peers in that environment. And when you're doing that assessment, you want to think about 4 questions, basically, and your text goes over this. What activities occur within this environment? How are they structured? What types of interactions are directed to students from teachers or other adults in the environment? So because you need to know what that teacher or other adult expectation is. And then what is the nature of peer interactions in that environment? Because those are going to be 2 different things, right? We have an adult or like an authority figure structure, and then we have the peer structure. And what are the social expectations in each of those? And then you want to conduct some direct observations of the typically developing peers, because you want to see how they're acting in those environments, what you're seeing from them, because that's what you're going to use to gauge what you teach your student. As talked about in chapter 4 and overall curriculum development, it's important to understand what your goals are in order to figure out the framework for the skills that you need to teach the student. So this assessment process is really, really important. So you want to do some backwards planning here. You want to think, what are the long-term goals for the students? And when I say that, I mean, what do they want to be doing as an adult? Are they interested in living on their own, or do they want to be married or live with roommates, or what is the plan? And when you think about that, in as far as where they're living and for workplace, what type of work do they want to do? That will help you figure out what the long-term social skill needs are for the student. And then you back it up from there, thinking about where the student is currently, where they want to be, and you then set up a series of long-term, then intermediate, then the short-term goals related to that. What are the baby steps to get us to that eventual long-term goal? And I'm talking, even if you're working with preschoolers, you want to be thinking about, what do we want for our student when he or she is an adult, and how do I start them on that process? Then once you get down to kind of your short-term goals, you task analyze those target skills, break them down into little steps so you can figure out how you want to appropriately teach those skills. It is essential to determine the proficiency of the target skills for that student. So now that you've sort of really honed in on the specific skill that you need, or skills you need to target, you need to evaluate the student. What's their baseline on this? So you want to do some direct observation, which is that event recording or duration recording, depending on the skill you're trying to teach. So event recording would be, how many times it's happening. It could be in response to how many times out of how many opportunities, or it could just be how many times, depending on what you're looking at. Duration, of course, is the time it takes to perform the skill or something of that, or maybe even start the skill if you're looking at initiation. So depending on what you're trying to the target skill you're trying to work toward, you want to do some direct observation on that. So you want to do that for your case study student, okay? Sometimes student social behavior should not be assessed, though, in authentic environments. Generally speaking, you want to go to that environment that it's really happening, set them loose, take some direct observation on how they do. But if that kind of setting is going to really stress your student out and result in either them becoming aggressive toward others or toward themselves, then this is not going to be a safe thing to do, right? So in that sense, you would assess them using a role play situation. So it's not as real, but it also reduces the stress level so that you can get at least some semblance of a baseline here. You can also use formal social and behavior scales. Your text lists some. Also, I wanted to mention table 7.2 in your text does break down the steps to assessing social skills using direct observation. So please use those steps in this process in your data collection and your observation for your case study. Table 7.3 has a list of those formal social and behavior skills. If you are not currently using anything, those are good resources for you as well. And then keep in mind that FBAs are really the result of those, the hypothesis that you gather is really going to be about a social skill essentially. So that FBA should also be an assessment that informs your social skill instruction, at least to some degree. All right, our next section focuses on the interventions that will hopefully help increase social skills and competence for your students. So the focus of methods for instruction within this next section cover two primary categories, and those are teacher-mediated instruction and peer-mediated instruction. In general, though, in all of those, you do need some interaction with peers. And it's a good way for children with autism to learn those socially valid social skills and to help achieve that generalization you need for them to actually perform these skills in a natural context, which is the ultimate goal, right? We want our students to be socially competent, which means they have to be able to do it in the environment as it arises. So things to consider, you want to start as early as possible. Early intervention is really effective in this area. So if you can start working on those social skills when they're wee ones, then that's the best plan. Try to teach the social skills in context as much as you can. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes that might lead to some aggressive stuff. So you have to think carefully through that. But in general, you want to teach it in the context it really happens. Teach activities that are preferred by peers without disabilities. Don't get too much into your silo that you're not even seeing what typical peers are doing. It's important. You want to reduce challenging behaviors because those can be a major barrier for social interaction with others. So that is going to be kind of a priority there. That doesn't mean you wait entirely to teach social skills, but you are going to have to work on reducing those challenging behaviors. Oops, go back. Teach pivotal behaviors. What are pivotal behaviors? Those are those behaviors that are influential across many areas of functioning. So if you think about initiating social interaction, that's going to be a pivotal skill in a variety of environments. Communication is a pivotal behavior. Appropriate affect. So, that how you say and react to people speaking, being able to have joint attention, that's a pivotal behavior. Ending an interaction or responding to interaction. Those are pivotal behaviors that will happen in a variety of ways in a variety of environments. So you want to focus on those because you're going to get the most bang for your buck there. The next step too would be to guard against potential problems related to inclusion. So some of the things we see here, you say, great, let's push for inclusion. And then you just send your kiddo out there with no real support or plan. And that's not what you want, okay? There should be a plan. It should be related to an IEP goal. It should be something that you go over with teachers, other adults in those settings. You may have to train peers to effectively interact with your student. So there's things to be done here before you just put kids out into inclusion and expect it to be successful. Essentially, you do not want to place without planning. You don't want to place without objectives. And then you really have to be careful about over-reliance on adult support. So just because you send a paraprofessional in there does not mean you've created an inclusive situation. In fact, the research has shown when you do that, what happens is the teacher doesn't interact with the student, the peers don't interact with the student because they just rely on that paraprofessional to do it all. So now you've created a complete isolation of the student from peers, and what we see is an overdependence on that paraprofessional by the student, and it definitely inhibits generalization of skills. So if that is happening, then the para needs to be trained too, to encourage that social interaction with peers and to support that and to fade his or her actual involvement or prompting. Okay, that's really key. And then the overall, you want to remember to emphasize generalization. And remember, chapter 5 had a whole thing on how do we teach generalization? What's the plan? You need to have a plan for that. It's especially important because without generalization, really you wasted a bunch of time. All right, so the intervention approaches, as I mentioned, and that we'll kind of review here in the chapter, are teacher-mediated, self-mediated, or peer-mediated. And research supports the use of these in isolation, but really it emphasizes the multi-component approach. So using a mix of these or all three can be very, very effective. But let's start with some teacher-mediated interventions. The first one would be direct instruction, the little DI, right? Could be a big DI too, because we do have some curricula that are scripted. Here's a couple of examples. Accepts or access are some social skills curricula. But in general, that direct instruction would involve some type of discussion, modeling, and role playing of the specific social skills. And this is generally in a teacher-led small group format. If you go to table 7.5, you'll see a breakdown of how to teach social skills using a direct instruction format. Instructional scripts are frequently used and taught to students to help them in certain situations. You give a basic script on how to respond or how to begin a greeting, right? You're teaching that script to the students so they have something somewhere to start. Story-based. Oh, right. So probably an important consideration here is that even if you have a scripted curricula or a basic format, keep in mind that your students are going to have different needs. So you're more than likely going to need to modify those curricula and those instructional scripts for the student. Play to their strengths, get them involved in that process, help them take ownership of those scripts and what they're going to say in certain settings. So just because it comes a certain way doesn't mean it has to stay that way. You definitely want to modify it and individualize it for your student and his or her needs. Story-based interventions are also an effective method of instruction for social skills. You may have heard the term social stories. It's actually a trademark term referring to a specific published type of curriculum. But keep in mind that social stories or story-based interventions should not be used in isolation. You can't just teach a social skill using a story and stop there and expect it to become something that a student applies. So it should be part of a comprehensive, like direct instruction plan used with antecedent prompting, which we're going to talk about in a second, and or peer-mediated interventions. All right, the other kind of chunk of teacher-mediated interventions are antecedent prompting procedures. And that's when the teacher is kind of there in a setting, or the paraprofessional even, this would be a good way to help teach the paraprofessional how to interact in an inclusive setting. They're there in that environment, but they're sort of taking a back seat, and they are paying attention to what's going on, but they're encouraging peer interaction, and they will provide kind of a least to most prompting as needed for the student in that situation. The key here is that you want to create a situation where that teacher role is, again, off to the side, kind of behind the scenes. They prompt as needed, but that there's some natural reinforcement from the peer and then the teacher when an interaction goes well. So, and then you want to try to fade, you want to use the least intrusive prompts possible. And you want to fade that prompting as quickly as you can, and watch out for that prompt dependence. We don't want that to happen. If you start seeing the student becomes dependent on that teacher providing some type of prompt, then you need to change it up. You either need to switch interventions, or you need to create a new contingency reinforcement system that that is rewarding and reinforcing to the student in a different way, so you can fade that prompt as soon as possible. So here we have an example of a social story to teach a student how to transition from a preferred to a less preferred activity without having a tantrum of some kind. So it's broken down into, you see the steps below. This is the story that is given to the student. So the teacher reads the story to Brent just before center time, several days in a row, right? We're prepping with the story. Brent also has access to this story throughout the day. And then Brent practices the target behaviors during or after reading this story. So you read through the story, you could practice it along the way, and then you could practice it after you read it, and that role play is, the less stressful time. It's a time of attention between the teacher and the student. So it's reinforcing for the student. And then hopefully when we then transition, then Brent learns that he can do this in a way that everyone finds reinforcing, and we can replace that initial target behavior that was not conducive to a good transition. Again, okay, so then the next section we're going to talk about are student-mediated techniques, and those break down primarily to a self-monitoring or video modeling or video self-modeling. Both are very effective evidence-based practices. Self-monitoring is a self-mediated socialization intervention where a student is taught to record. They do an event recording each time that they perform that target behavior. It's important to understand, though, that self-monitoring is actually a generalization strategy. So it is not to be used in the acquisition of a skill. When a student is still in that initial acquisition phase, you need to be teaching that skill. Self-monitoring is what you can then use when you're working on building fluency, maintenance, and generalization. So important. Can't jump straight to self-monitoring when they don't actually understand what the skill is yet. Video modeling is when an intervention where the student will view a brief video of someone demonstrating the target skill. When it's video self-monitoring, it's actually where the child or the student with autism is videoed completing the target skill successfully. And then they can watch that to review how it's supposed to be. So both are very effective practices to implement. So that can definitely be something you build into your planning. The last piece we'll cover are peer-mediated interventions, and that's when we really get those peers involved with this process. And it needs to be well planned. And again, you don't just do a peer-mediated intervention. It should be really part of a comprehensive social skills intervention. The peer needs to be trained in the procedures and how to reinforce the student for their collaboration in this process. It should take place during a high interest activity, things like lunch or recess, something like that, where peers are typically interacting and can provide a lot of natural reinforcement. It's best accomplished using one other peer. So one peer and one student with autism as a dyad working together rather than multiple peers, because what the research shows is those multiple peers start just interacting with each other and not the student with autism. So keep that in mind. It works best in a dyad situation. Remember the peers, you need to train them in how to help that prompt, help prompt them in that socialization. And you can secretly train that. It's a secret training situation. Hey, Johnny, will you, at lunch today, will you go up and say hi to Brent and, encourage him to respond to you. Don't let him ignore you, that kind of thing. But you want to train them in that process and what your expectations are. Your text goes into steps, in-depth steps for all of these. So make sure you're digging into that, especially as you develop your lesson plans. And then once you've really helped teach the acquisition of the skill and you've built the fluency of the skill, then we start going into maintenance and generalization. And again, remember that we really need to plan for generalization. It's not necessarily just going to happen. That's, one of the challenges of our students, generally speaking, is that they don't generalize well. So direct instruction is probably needed, and a plan for that is needed. So let's look at those strategies. What will help increase the likelihood of generalization of social skills? One, teach those skills that are naturally reinforced in the target environments. Teach peers and other teachers to respond appropriately to students' correct social behaviors. And this is hard because a lot of times as teachers, if they're acting appropriately, we sort of just carry on. We don't notice because it's not a maladaptive behavior standing out. So it's important that as teachers, you're really, really paying attention. And when you see the student actually even close to demonstrate the correct social behavior, you're there to reinforce that and encourage that. And you want to ignore or redirect that inappropriate behavior. And you want to have a plan for how you're going to approach that. Obviously, you can't ignore self-injurious behaviors or aggressive behaviors toward others, so you'll have to redirect those. Number 3, you're going to use many examples in the teaching process. Keep in mind, when you teach a long division or any kind of math problem, you don't just teach them one problem, right? You do a multitude of examples. So same thing here. You want to program common stimuli or make the training situation as much like a real life situation as you possibly can, because that's going to help with that generalization. That's why CBI is so important, because if you're trying to teach social skills or communication skills in a grocery store, you can practice it in your classroom, but the chances of them generalizing that are very slim. So actually doing it, going to the grocery store and practicing those skills is far more effective. Number 5, once students demonstrate acquisition of target behaviors in the instructional setting, then begin to vary components of those instructional lessons. So that's the general case programming that you might remember from, I believe it was chapter 5, and talking about generalization procedures. So here's where you're going to start to vary one component. Maybe a different teacher teaches the lesson. Maybe you try it at a different time of day. Maybe you use different peers. Maybe you use a different classroom or a different setting. So you're starting to kind of broaden the scope of the individual's practice. But again, the student should be at acquisition before you do this. They should have demonstrated kind of a mastery of that acquisition phase with like a consistent setting. And then you start playing with those variables. 6, you teach the students to actively recruit their own reinforcement. Have them look for teach them to ask the teacher if they're in, let's say, a specials class where they're working on this social skill, and that teacher doesn't do a great job noticing when the student is is performing that skill that they're working on appropriately. So teach the student to ask the teacher at the end of class or at an appropriate time, how did I do today on my, saying hi? Teach them to ask for that reinforcement. 7, teach students to recognize the types of reinforcers used by general educators. So again, that's why that ecological assessment is so important. What does that general education teacher typically use as a reinforcer for the students in their class? This may be very different from what the student with autism is used to. So you would want to teach them, hey, this is a reinforcer in that class. Isn't that, and you may want to implement that in your own classroom so that it's familiar and that they see it as reinforcing. All right, that's a real quick down and dirty. Again, you're going to want to go into your text. You're going to want to dig into it and look at it closely, and different ways to break down and teach social skills. There are some curricula that are given in there, and some pointers on how to set this all up. But let's summarize the chapter quickly. We know socialization is one of the most critical areas of intervention for students with autism because it becomes such a barrier to their success in with peers, with job settings, etc. Social behavior improvements often produce concomitant improvements. I can't talk today, which means it crosses over into other areas like communication and play. So when you really work on those, they do have some natural crossover into other components that students with autism generally are working on. Intervention efforts to remediate socialization deficits can result in significant improvements, especially when you catch those kids early in preschool, especially because it's a very a natural time to work on those social skills. You're working on that generally with all of your preschoolers. So socialization interventions evolved from kind of simplistic interventions to those that are more complex. Variety of interventions have been shown to produce desired outcomes. Like we mentioned, teacher-mediated, self-mediated, and peer-mediated. But ideally, you're doing a combination of those. Ultimately, social competence is the goal of all of this training and intervention. You want your students to be socially competent. But thoughtful planning, when you're doing your interventions, can result in very improved social outcomes. So, take it seriously and plan it out. This is not something you really want to wing. Effective social behavior is necessary for functioning in all areas of life. It is an important prerequisite to mental health and happiness, because if we want interpersonal relationships and so on, there's a level of effective social behavior that needs to take place. That doesn't mean you're creating little Stepford wife robots, but helping them especially achieve their own goals. That's the important part. Make sure the goals you're working toward are ones that the student wants to work toward. Educators must address socialization deficits at a young age and continue with effective interventions. So you keep on working on those skills as needed, but using evidence-based practices. All right, y'all, that's the end of my chat today. I hope you enjoyed, and let me know if you have questions.